Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's actually interesting to hear the response across the way when my friend here actually tells the truth. They're laughing. They think it's a joke. The reality is their talking points have been off all day because people have been charged. They were charged when our government was in power. 3 of them were charged. 2 of them are considered to be or presumed to be dead. The other person did go to trial, and as far as I know, that trial is still ongoing. So the Liberals can do what they want to mislead people. I see they're heckling across the way right now, trying to disrupt the proceedings this afternoon as well. But their talking points consistently today have been inaccurate, and I don't know why they would mislead people on terrorism-related issues. I wonder why that would happen, Mr. Speaker. We know full well how weak they are on this very issue. I want to talk about the last part of our motion today. We've talked a lot about ISIS and talked about them paying taxpayers' dollars to terrorists and giving them money for that kind of thing, trying to reintegrate terrorists back into Canada, welcome them back, working with other countries actually to bring citizens of, if you want to call it Canadian citizens of convenience back here, where our government's volunteering to help, where citizens of own countries don't want them to come back. But I want to talk about a little bit of a different issue this afternoon than some other people have spoken of, and that is about this plan that they're supposed to bring in 45 days, because the Liberals have said they're going to support, apparently, this motion that we brought forward, and it calls for a plan to bring to justice anyone who is in Canada, as in Canadian citizenship, has fought as a terrorist or participated in a terrorist activity. I would like to take a little bit of a view of the reciprocal of that repatriation plan and talk about the people and the places that are most impacted by what has happened, and that would be the victims and those who have become refugees. And I think the government should consider this in their plan for the future, because we're not only dealing with terrorists, we're dealing with the impact on many other people as well. And I think in the way we need to, in the future rather, we need to address these people in a way that will deal with some of the problems that we faced in the past here. There's a number of communities, Mr. Speaker, that we're familiar with that were not treated fairly over the past few years in terms of this ISIS attacks and their conflict. And those included the Christian communities on the Nineveh Plain. They included the Copts, included the Yazidi community, and many of the minority Muslim communities as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about that for a few minutes here today. Now, it's interesting this government is actually pursuing reintegration for people who claim to hate the very values of our country, and those who have left here to pursue other more violent application of their own twisted values. They were a part of this conflict that imposed so much violence and death and rape on so many minority communities. And as I mentioned, it particularly hit the Yazidi communities, and their the implications of this violence on them is a little bit more well known, I think, probably than the impact of the violence on some of the Christian communities on the Nineveh Plain and some of the pressure on the Copts, for example, and Sunni Muslim communities that were in that area as well. And the government's now actively trying to bring some of these people back to Canada. It's a very strange thing, but it's such a contrast in how they dealt with the victims of these terrorists. So they're welcoming the terrorists back, trying to find ways to bring them back, reintegrate them, find them, we talk about poetry classes and counseling and those kinds of things. But they're not actually as concerned about the victims of these people at all, especially when it comes to those who've been targeted because of their religious or ethnic issues and religious or ethnic positions. 80% of the world's population still faces high or very high levels of persecution because of faith issues around the globe. And we're familiar with what happened here, which was ISIS swept across northern Iraq and into Syria, devastating many of the minority communities. Some people ended up in the UN camps as refugees. The larger minority groups ended up there. But a lot of the smaller minority groups could not find their way into the camps because the camps were not safe for them in a conflict area. And so they were in other places, either in private homes or outside the camps, trying to survive. And this PM was clear that he was not interested in helping those who were affected by this conflict and those who are affected primarily because of their specific religious and ethnic places that they come from. In fact, in October of 2015, he made a statement, and I think it's either arrogance or ignorance that's unbelievable in this statement, where he said, when asked twice, will you prioritize religious and ethnic minorities in terms of bringing refugees here, he gave a long lecture about how he expressed his disapproval of anyone who would use refugees in a photo op, and I thought that's ironic given what we've seen later. But he said clearly to him the idea of prioritizing religious and ethnic communities in terms of bringing them here because of the fact they belong to those communities. He said the idea was actually disgusting, that it did not contribute to the Canada we want to build, and his government would absolutely not go along with that. Now, that's a strange type of response to the type of vicious persecution, I think, that was taking place at the time. And that persecution was taking place specifically because of the religious and ethnic identity of these communities. That's the very reason that these communities were targeted, and this government has said that's the very reason why we're not going to consider the fact that you should perhaps get priority in coming to this country. And when the Liberals wanted to set up their post-election PR refugee program, where did they go? They went into the UN camps and found the people who were in the camps there, but at the same time left the most vulnerable refugee communities unexplored in terms of bringing people here and giving them a new start in Canada. And that involved the Yazidis at the time. You are familiar with the struggle we've had in this House to try to convince the Liberals that there was actually a serious issue around the Yazidi communities. They finally bent on that. They really haven't gone very far in helping those folks out, but at least they acknowledged there was a problem in the end. The other communities didn't get that same consideration. And I guess, was that deliberate? I think it had to be so, because the Prime Minister said specifically that that was how he was going to address it. I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, the real cynicism arises when you see the Liberals changing their position simply on something just because it suits them. I'm going to give you an example of this. So if you go back to the Middle East and what was happening on the Nineveh Plains, the Prime Minister said, we will not bring people here based on their religious and ethnic identities. And so they made every attempt to make sure that did not take place. But it was kind of interesting that when it affects them, all of a sudden they'll take a different position. And I want to bring up something that happened a couple of weeks ago here in the House. There has been a group of Sikh and Hindu refugees in India that have tried to get recognition for the persecution they faced in Afghanistan. And that's been very specific to their religion. The Liberals have had virtually no interest in this issue at all, no interest in bringing them here, until 3 weeks ago, when our leader was in India, met with this group and assured them of our concern and that we would follow up on it. Mr. Speaker, it was interesting that the first day back in the House, they came up, one of their members asked a question about Sikh and Hindu minorities in Afghanistan face persecution, discrimination, violence. Thousands have been forced to flee. Many are living in very precarious conditions. What's the minister going to do? Will he update the House on the status of the effort to resettle these vulnerable refugees? And the response was very specific, that we are deeply concerned about, and I guess this is specific identity, ethnic identity, Afghan, Hindu, and Sikh minorities in Afghanistan. We understand these particular refugees are a particular risk. That's why we've been working very closely, not only to identify them, but also to expand resettlement opportunities into Canada. And so, Mr. Speaker, we're glad to see them finally come to the position the Conservative Party has held all along, that people need to be considered when they're targeted for persecution because of their religious or ethnic identities. They should be considered, and that should be a factor in the fact as to whether they get to come to our country or not. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know my time's running out. I'm sorry that that's the case, but it's hard not to be very cynical about this group of Liberals. Their concern and their reaction is always about themselves. It's not about Canadians. And we see that they will do what works for them. Canadians have an opportunity to let them know that this does not work for them when they have this openness to bringing terrorists back here. They're excited about being able to reintegrate them back into this community, but they're much more reluctant to actually bring the most vulnerable groups here, to identify them by the very nature of the persecution that's taking place against them, and then give them an opportunity to come to Canada. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to try to hold these people accountable over the next few months when they bring this reintegration plan into place, to make sure that they're not only preventing Canadian safety or creating a situation where Canadians are unsafe, but they're also creating a situation where some of these most vulnerable minorities can be taken care of ahead of these terrorists that are returning.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Mr. Speaker, and I can only imagine the alarm and panic button that was sounded earlier this afternoon when the Whip's office on the other side of the House discovered that we would be voting in favour of this motion. The Conservatives would have had to run around changing all their talking points, which they're clearly doing now. The reality of this situation is, Mr. Speaker, when we look at issues like this, we don't look at them through an ideological lens. We look at them through the practical realities of it, and this is a motion that can be supported from this side of the House. But I'm really glad that the member on the other side brought up Yazidi women and and the hardships that so many people face. The reality of the situation is, Mr. Speaker, that we, the Liberal government, have provided a home to 1,400 women and their family who endured the brutality of Daesh, and 85% of them were Yazidi. Yet the former Conservative government brought in a grand total of 3 Yazidi women into Canada. Now, can the member opposite, given his newfound love for supporting refugees, please explain to this House why the former Conservative government was only able to bring over 3 Yazidi refugees, where this government has brought over 1,000?
Well, member for Cypress Hills, Grasslands.
I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, this is just about enough to make someone throw up, that this government now tries to pretend that somehow they had an interest in Yazidi women. That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in this House. If it wasn't for the member from Calgary Nose Hill doing the work that she's done on this issue, bringing this to the House time and time and time again, these people would have nothing to do with them to this day.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in a nonpartisan spirit, I find myself having difficulty with this debate, but I certainly want to make it clear to anyone in this House, the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands has nothing new found in his respect for human rights, his fight for the rights of minorities anywhere in the world to express and practice their religious freedoms. But I do find it difficult that the Liberal government members have decided to, I guess, get rid of a political problem by voting for a motion that I can't vote for. I've been here in the House for the debate all day, and I just can't bring myself to vote for something that says that we have a history of making mistakes. The effort here to further demonize a decision in relation to Omar Khadr, which is one that I can't in good conscience ever put out something for purposes of avoiding a propaganda tool for a future election. I can't compromise myself enough to say that that was a mistake. That was the right thing to do, and Mr. Khadr, on the evidence that I've looked into, was not even a soldier, certainly not a terrorist, may not have committed any offense, but the reality is we know the courts have told us that several different governments in this country violated his rights. So I ask my honourable friend from Cypress Hills Grasslands to forgive me that I can't be part of a 2019 Conservative election ploy, but I respect him from the bottom of my heart.
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, she can take her position on that, Mr. Speaker. She's got her own political things that she needs to do with this motion. But the reality is, I'm going to tell you, it is when a group is targeted because of their religion, or a group is targeted because of their ethnic identity, and that is why they are targeted, the least a responsible government can do is to consider that and whether they're going to allow them to have some sort of status within a refugee program. Now, this government, this Prime Minister made it clear in October 2015 that he thought that that was disgusting. Well, I actually think it's disgusting if you're not going to consider that when people are targeted specifically because of those identity issues that they have.
Questions and comments? I have time for one more short question and response. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the member across the way can understand why it is that many of us on this side, when we listen to members such as he has just explained, why it is that we get a little bit aggravated, because when you say, for example, the government doesn't care about the Yazidi women, when in fact we have seen 1,000 plus under this regime compared to a handful from the previous regime. When we see hundreds of millions cut from the Harper days to the reinstatement of badly needed resources, when we see more progressive legislation on this side and regressive legislation from the Harper era, I'm sure the member can understand and appreciate why it is that at times we get frustrated, because it seems to me the Conservatives want to talk a tough line. But when it comes time to actually deliver, that we have seen this government time and time again on many different areas, especially in this area, deliver for Canadians.
Member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we know that's inaccurate. He could try to rewrite history all that he wants, and it's fine. If anyone's been familiar with the debates in here, particularly around the Yazidis, they would know that the initiative and the impetus for any care that was shown to that community came from this side of the House, and particularly from the member from Calgary Nose Hill. She wasn't as stubborn as she was, and if she hadn't kept coming back to this or whatever, this government would have let none of them in here. They could have cared less until they were forced into accepting, first of all, that there was a genocide that had taken place, and secondly, that that community needed to be brought here. I would actually make a suggestion to the member opposite that maybe they take a look at some of the other communities over there, like the Christian communities which were wiped out on the Nineveh Plains, and give them some special consideration as well.